in 1991, which was 11 years ago, and I can remember in that lecture, which was an informal lecture to the graduate school, I can remember talking about Geoffrey's work in the 1980s and the fact that his projects had become very much bigger. Projects like the Sri Lanka Parliament and the Ruhuna University. And he hadn't enjoyed that business of being involved with very big projects. And by the end of the 1980s, he was tired and somewhat disillusioned. And of course, he was 70 years old in 1989. And I remember saying in the lecture that he'd withdrawn from this practice, Edwards, Reed and Begg, that he'd run for the previous 30 years. And he'd broken his partnership with his engineer colleague Pulugasundram, and that in effect he'd retired. Well, there must have been some member of the Sri Lanka Mafia in the audience, because 2 days later I had a phone call from Geoffrey Bawa in Colombo, and he said, "David, I've heard that you've been telling everybody at the AA that I've retired, and this is simply not true. I've simply withdrawn from Edwards, Reed and Begg, but I'm now starting a new practice. And it would be nice if you came out and saw what we were doing sometime." Well, that was the first time I gave a lecture. The second time was in February 1998. And that coincided with an article that I'd written for AA Files. And it was a very appropriate moment, February 1998, because it was the 50th anniversary of Sri Lanka's independence. And it was the 50th anniversary of Geoffrey Bawa's purchase of the estate at Lunuganga, which he was to transform into a garden. So it seemed highly appropriate. Sadly, what then happened, only a week later, after that lecture, Geoffrey Bawa had a terrible stroke, which completely paralyzed him and took away his power of speech. And sadly, that is how he has been for the last 4 years. So today, what I thought I'd do was to talk about really what happened between those two lectures. Between 1990, when he withdrew from the practice he'd been in, and 1998, when he had his stroke. But because I thought perhaps you might need some introduction, I'm going to go very quickly through just a few illustrations of his early life and the projects that he's better known for. So, first of all, before we look at Geoffrey in the 90s, I'll just go very quickly through, give you a potted biography, if you like. He was born in 1919 in Sri Lanka, what was then Ceylon. His father, on that left-hand slide, was a very wealthy lawyer. He was a Muslim, Sri Lankan Muslim, that is to say, a Sri Lankan of Arab descent. Bawa is a Muslim name. And he married the woman on the left, Bertha Marian Schrader. She was a Dutch burgher. That is to say, not that she was Dutch, but that she belonged to a group of Eurasians who were called in Sri Lanka Dutch burghers because they were descended from employees of the East India Company. And Benjamin Bawa was extremely wealthy, and they lived in a large house in Darley Road, and there you can see them with their pony cart. So Bawa's father died when he was very young, and he was brought up very much by his mother and his elder brother, and they were quite wealthy. They were obsessed with cars. That's one of the family cars on the right, and this is Geoffrey's first motor car on the left, at least a pedal cycle car. And the Schraders had estates north of Colombo where Geoffrey would spend a lot of his time, and they lived in these very typical 19th century Anglo-Dutch Sinhalese. villas. The one on the left is called Wester Seaton, which belonged to one of Geoffrey's uncles, and the one on the right is called Kimberley, which belonged to another. And the photograph on the right, still you can see the family car. This is a 1920 Chevrolet, which is still there, though the family sold the house many years ago. In fact, interestingly, just a reflection on what happens to buildings, the house on the left is now a Cheshire home for people with educational difficulties, and the house on the right is a brothel. And Geoffrey, before the Second World War, in 1938, came to Europe and studied English at Cambridge and then law in London, and only returned to Sri Lanka in 1946, so he spent 8 years here in England. And then in 46 he tried working as a lawyer and hated it, and then sold what property he still had, left Ceylon and set out on a world tour which took him across America and back to Europe. And in the end he decided he'd like to buy a villa in Italy and never ever go back to Sri Lanka. But that whole project fell through, and in 48, just as Sri Lanka was getting its independence, he returned there and he bought this old rubber estate about 50 miles south of Colombo, near the coast, near to Ben Toto. And it was about 25 acres of rubber and this rather ugly old house. And he was determined to convert this into an Italian garden. And it was this project which very quickly, I mean, he was full of ideas, but he soon discovered that he lacked all technical knowledge. And so he decided that he would become an architect. And in 1953, he came here to the AA, persuaded the then head of school, Michael Patrick, to allow him to go straight into third year. And then he spent 3 years here. He enjoyed it himself very much, though in the his third year, his final year, he actually spent most of his time in Rome, which you could do in those days, and he occasionally drove back in his Rolls-Royce to Bedford Square and somehow managed to pass all of the examinations in 1957. This is a project which he did as a student with John Killick, and it was published in Architectural Design, and his thesis was on the work of Balthasar Neumann, which you can see an example here. It's a church called Vierzehnheiligen in Germany. Sorry, wrong buttons. So he came back to Ceylon in 1957. By this time he was 38 years old. He'd been a dilettante, a traveller, a rather reluctant lawyer, and now he was setting out to become an architect. And he took over a practice called Edwards, Reed and Begg, and this was the name he practiced under until 1990. And Edwards, Reed and Begg were 3 British architects, there they are on the left, and they'd formed their practice in 1923, and by the time Geoffrey appeared on the scene they were all dead, and so he was really just buying their name and what was left of their practice. But they had built some very impressive buildings, and they were superb draftsmen, as you can see on the right. This is a block of flats called Gallface Court. Oh, I keep pressing the wrong one, sorry. Very soon after starting in the practice, Bawa took on a young Danish architect who was in Sri Lanka, and he was called Ulrich Plesner, and he worked with Bawa from 1958 until 1967. And there's no doubt that he had a very close relationship with Bawa, and probably a considerable influence on Bawa, the evolution of Bawa's early ideas. This shows on the left an early house that they did in Anuradhapura, just nearing completion. On the right, a discussion with a Catholic priest from India who was one of their clients. This is an example of Bawa's early work, and it could be described as typical of what one might call tropical modernism. So he'd been very much influenced here at the AA by what was then a fairly new school of tropical architecture, and the work of Maxwell Fry Jane Drew. And this is very typical of work of that time. There was this sort of an almost universal global idea of what tropical architecture should be. Rain screens, horizontal lines, overhanging cantilevering screens, and so on. This is a school, it's called Bishop's College, and it's typical of a number of projects that Bawa did in the late 50s and early 60s. But very soon he realized that this was not appropriate to Sri Lanka, that all of this crisp whiteness soon faded, that the idea of the flat roof, this isn't actually a flat roof, it's a very, very gently pitched roof which is hiding behind that beam, so it looks as if it's a flat roof. But the idea of a flat roof, of crisp whiteness, just didn't work in a hot, humid climate. Soon all the white surfaces became stained. And Bawa soon realized that the important thing about a building in the tropics is the roof, and that what one can do is to exploit the patination that results from the climate. Sorry, this damn thing. This is just a close-up of the screens in that school. This sort of realization that the roof was very important came about partly in this project, which was a house for a doctor in Gaul. And you can see that from the plan that in a way it's a sort of Miesian plan, almost like a sort of pinwheel revolving around the core. It's a sloping site. The bottom of the hill is the doctor's surgery, and then there's this really strange but rather exciting, almost like a tunnel that connects up the hill to the main sitting room and entrance. And then the servants' and kitchen's quarters are here, and then there's a little flat for the doctor's sister. And the house itself is a courtyard, around a courtyard. So in the Miesian plan, the courtyard has replaced the fireplace. And the whole thing is under one sloping roof, which goes from the top to the bottom. And you can see how the pinwheel plan envelops the garden. So it's as if the plan is reaching out to colonize the garden and relate the garden space to the internal living space. That's actually the living room, and it opens up to the garden. This is the corridor down to the doctor's surgery, and that's the central courtyard. And that's a picture that I took in 1997 when we were talking about doing a book, and I persuaded Geoffrey to come and look at this house with me, and it was the first time he'd been for about 25 years, and he was very moved. And this is the central courtyard on the right and the entrance court on the left. These early buildings were done very cheaply with local materials. There was a complete ban on imports. So for instance, this pool here, which seems to be blue tiles, they couldn't get blue tiles, and they used broken milk of magnesia bottles. Then the house which somehow brought all of these ideas together was the Enid'silver House. This is a house for a rather eccentric lady on an urban plot, what was thought to be a very small plot at that time. It's about what we call in Sri Lanka a 30 perch plot, which is about 750 square meters. And suddenly Geoffrey had this idea of turning a house inside out. Instead of having the house as a villa at the center of a garden, the garden is brought to the center of the house. So it could be said to have been inspired by ancient Roman houses, or by the Dutch townhouse idea, the Muslim townhouse idea, or it could have been inspired by the Sinhalese Walawe. It could have been all of those things. Geoffrey was never very specific about the things that influenced him, but it was completely revolutionary. Certainly in the modern era, nobody had put forward a proposition for a house which was completely inward-looking. And today in Sri Lanka, this sort of house is so common that people think that it must always have been so. But this was the very first. This was done in 1960, and there was no house like it. You can see here the central courtyard, the Meda Midula. You enter from the road. There is a set of columns that support just a screen, a stirp, and then there's an entrance courtyard. And you go through that axis, sorry, I lost it, through that corridor, and there's a guest atelier here, and an office, and the garage here, and then the servants and kitchens and things are down with little courtyards of their own. And here is the sitting room, the dining room, a Buddhist shrine, the staircase, and then the bedrooms in the two-story part. This drawing is what was done for the Bawa book of 1986. This is the original drawing from 1990, which is upstairs in the exhibition. And this is done by Lucky Senanayaka. And if you look carefully at it upstairs, you'll see that it's done with an ordinary ink pen, and there is the pressure of the line varies the thickness. What is unique about the style of drawing that evolved is that you see that the garden in the drawing is as important as the house. And actually in that section you can hardly distinguish between what is inside and what is outside. So there's a continuum of inside and outside space. And these are just early photographs of that house, contemporary photographs, and this is how it looks today. A very beautiful house. An early scheme for a church. This is the Bandra Convent Chapel. Very little known, hardly ever published, but a very simple church of rubble construction, all the materials from the site, tiled roof, and inside we have an original photograph from '62. You can see this vaulted timber ceiling and then this glass wall with the crucifixes. And through that glass wall you see this wonderful view of paradise. So these old nuns, this was up in the hills, it was a place for clapped out nuns to go when their nunning days were over, and they could look out at paradise that was waiting for them through the glass. Very, very beautiful building. And another astonishing house from the mid-60s is called Polon Talawa, an estate bungalow which has again not really been published. And it responds to a long tradition in Sri Lanka of building in caves under rocks. That's a lovely painting by Davy of the 19th century showing a Buddhist temple built under rocks. And this house Geoffrey proposed to be built in this collection of boulders, a very remote site. And the roof spans from one boulder to another. So you enter as if entering a cave through these huge boulders. And then here's the interior. On the right, a contemporary picture. And somehow or other they managed to get a grand piano out into the jungle. Whether it was just for the photograph, I don't know. And that's how it looks today. So the roof spans from boulder to boulder. Then, later in the 60s, this is for the Catholic Church. It's a convent, an orphanage for young girls to learn about farming, a convent farm. And this is one of these beautiful drawings on the left, the plan of this chapel, and on the right, a panorama. These are drawings done by an assistant called Anura Ratnavibhushan. And here we see what is evolving is a sort of a style which is modern very much influenced by, for instance, Corb. We have the cantilevering white forms and so on. But then there's something about it, the roof forms and so on, which root it in a Sinhalese Dutch-Portuguese tradition. And this is one of the dormitories in the central courtyard of the convent. Then Bawa's first tourist hotel in 1967, the Bentota Beach Hotel, which I think was one of the most beautiful hotels to have been built in Asia, and it set new standards and was the first hotel probably anywhere in Asia to offer something special, something that was related to the place where it was. That's a very early sketch of it on the left, and there's the plan of it. It's built on a mound around a central courtyard. And there's an aerial photograph. And you come across this bridge after a very scary journey from Colombo, and you're driven underneath this building here into a dark cavern, and you see this incredible staircase going up towards this lovely ceiling designed by Enid'silver. This is the most beautiful hotel, and it existed absolutely in pristine condition until 1997, when the owners decided to give it a refurb, and so it's now got a green plastic roof, and that ceiling's gone, but that's what happens. And when you went to the top of the stairs, you got this fantastic view across the courtyard, across the sitting area, towards the sea, with these aralia trees in the courtyard. And that shows some of the furniture in the sitting area. Then, in the 70s, there was a change of government in Sri Lanka, and Bawa got very worried because there was a socialist government, and he thought he was losing all his work, his clients, and he looked for work abroad and started an office in India. And this is just one project from that period, the Madurai Club, which was a club for the employees of Madurai coats, and again was built with the materials gathered from around the site. And this was a very early example of bricolage, incorporating old objects, these Chickadee columns and so on, into a new building. And then at the end of the 1970s, things looked up again for Bawa, because although there was a socialist government, very soon that government was turning to him for work, for projects. And so he transformed himself into the architect of the socialist state and built, for instance, here the first high office building in Colombo, which is called the Mahaweli building. And it's been hailed by the Malaysian architect Ken Yang as the very first bioclimatic skyscraper. It had very interesting ideas for natural ventilation, and its plan was very carefully designed to get minimum amount of solar intrusion, but it aligned very carefully with the prevailing monsoon winds. And the shape of it looks a little bit sort of square from that angle, but as you move around it, from every side, it takes on a different shape. So these are just two other views of this building. And then in the 80s, these large projects. Up till then, a lot of Geoffrey Bawa's designing had been done on site, and that, for instance, Bentota Hotel was done with about 20 drawings. But now, with a project like this, which was a huge project, 40,000 square meters, which had to be done in 3 years with Japanese contractors, it involved in the end about 5,000 drawings. And Geoffrey couldn't just go onto site and change things. And he didn't enjoy this process at all, though it is a very interesting building. There we see it today. There's the main chamber and the members' garden. But Geoffrey really didn't enjoy that sort of process. One house from this period, very startlingly interesting house. This again is just showing different types of drawing, and that's the sort of local planning permission drawing on the left, and a later drawing that was done for the White Book on the right. But this was a house which was to be inserted within the garden of a house that Bawa had done in the early 60s, and it had to go into the sort of corner. And so his idea was to have this garage, and then there's like a tunnel which takes you past the other house to this 4-story, almost like a tower, insinuated within this huge Mahabodhi tree. And it's a stunning house, very simple. So already by this time, Bawa was moving on from that sort of what one might call regionalist, vernacular modernism towards something more sparse. And this is that house. The interior, it belongs to a man who's was obsessed with hunting, so he filled it with trophies, which looks slightly bizarre. But you can see it's a very strict, very simple architecture of space and of light and movement. And they're just views of the main staircase. And then, also from the 80s, another hotel, I won't say much about it. This is the Triton, where you arrive at this lake and you see the sea through the entrance hall. It's a very tactile place, very hard to describe in a slide. It's all about air, wind, monsoon, and the sound of the sea. These are just views. It's an internal courtyard, one of the terraces. And then, at the end of this decade, he completed this enormous university campus, which is in the south of Sri Lanka, or Druhunu. And they're just two views of that. So that really brings me to that point in 1991. What I've gone through now is a very, very brief summary of a very rich period of 30 years of development. And at the age of 70, 71, Bawa withdrew from this practice, Edwards Reed and Begg, broke his partnership, left the office and went home. But instead of retiring, as he had every right to at that age, and as I had actually announced here at that time, he hadn't. He started a little office from his home with a completely new staff of young architects, at first only 2 of them. And he, because there'd been a book published about his work in 1986, he was receiving requests from all over Asia, from developers, for him to come and design office buildings, hotels, and so on. And he was very amused by this and didn't take it very seriously. But when a project interested him, he said, right, okay, we'll come and do something. My fee is $10,000 and first-class airfare for myself and my assistants, and first-class hotel accommodation. And so he did a number of these projects, which I've called the $10,000 projects. These are just cartoons from the office. There was a wonderful draftsman who did some of the lovely drawings of Lunuganga upstairs, called Sumangala, and he did these little cartoons. And the one on the right just shows Geoffrey going off to Singapore with his assistant Dilshan, and he at this time would pretend to be ill, though of course he was always chain smoking, but being in a wheelchair got him through the customs and everything, and his assistant was left to carry all the suitcases and bring all the drawings. But this just illustrated all these hotel designs that these people tackled in the early 1990s. And one of the very first projects was the Singapore Cloud Centre, which was an astonishing project. He was approached by the Singapore Tourist Board and the Botanical Gardens to design this artificial montane forest environment, and he proposed these glass pyramids. And it would have been like the Grimshaw, what's it called, the Eden Project, thank you. And I know Christophe Bon the architect from Chamberlain Pallenborn, always said that this, if it had been built, would have been Bawa's greatest project. But it wasn't built. And this was the design for an astonishing hotel on Barley called the Barley Hyatt extension. And I won't say much about it except that you can see the entrance and the sea, and there is a swimming pool 200 meters long, so you could swim from the entrance to the sea. And the houses are arranged in these clusters, and then that's a special presidential pavilion. And though it wasn't built, it was enormously influential and was the forerunner for these hotels like the Aman hotels that you may have heard of. These are just drawings from that project. And this is, I'll skip this, it's a design for terraced row houses for a developer in Singapore. These are called the Albert Teo row houses. But again, the design was developed, but it wasn't built. And this is a house on the island of Fiji for a man called Larry, forgotten his name, it's on the drawing, Larry somebody or other. This was built, but not really at all to Geoffrey's designs. And it was published, but it shouldn't really be regarded as a Geoffrey design the way it was built. But these just show these lovely drawings that were developed for that project. And another hotel on the island of Bintan. This is called Banyan Tree Hotel. And here the developers, who are called the Ho brothers, got Geoffrey to do this wonderful design and then sacked him from the job. And then 2 years later they started off again and they produced their own design in-house, which was copied from this, which I think is really quite terrible. But it didn't have any of the quality of Bawa's design. That just shows parts of this wonderful concept for a hotel. And this is a house in Ahmedabad in India for a very wealthy industrialist called Sarabhai. Sarabhai you might know because he owned one of the Ahmedabad houses built by Le Corbusier. It's called the Sarabhai House, so it wasn't initially built for Sarabhai. And Sarabhai thought, well, he would like to collect great architects. If he had a house by Corb, he would also like one by Geoffrey Bawa. And Bawa did the drawing, but didn't like the man and decided he wouldn't take it any further. He didn't like the fact that Mr. Sarabhai used to sit on the floor. He said, I'm not going to design a house for a man who sits on the floor. And then another house in India, a huge house in Delhi for a lady called Modi. And this went to quite a late stage. And this is very typical at this time. Geoffrey would write letters to his clients on the drawing. You can just see that there. It usually ended, I hope you like it. But this was a huge house in Delhi, which wasn't built. And then one scheme that he really loved, a family suddenly appeared in Colombo from Bangalore, and they had bought this old fort, which was called the Chickadee Fort. And it belonged to an old courtesan of a Maharaja. And they wanted, it had a stepped well in it, and the remains of a temple. And they wanted to convert it into a house. And Geoffrey thought this was absolutely splendid, and did these lovely drawings for a house. But in the end, the wealthy courtesan was stabbed to death by her relatives, who wanted to prevent her from selling the fort. So it didn't happen. The wrong direction. And another hotel not built, the Orion. So by 1992, there's been about 3 years of this activity, lots of projects, nothing being built. But Geoffrey enjoying himself. And then came this project which did get built. And this was a hotel in the center of Sri Lanka, near to a wonderful historic archaeological site called Sigiriya. And he was asked to design the hotel at Sigiriya. And here is the Sigiriya is on the top there of this plan. And Bawa went there, and by then he was quite an imposing figure, well known, looked at the site and said, I'm not going to build a hotel there. But I seem to remember that there is 2 or 3 miles, in fact 8 miles, to the south there's this lovely lake, a tank, and why don't we go and look at that? So he took all the directors and the government minister on a trek in a Land Rover down to this site and said, that's where you're going to build your hotel. And, well, that more or less is what happened. I mean, the way the story is told and the way, in fact, it was enacted made it all seem very accidental. But I actually think Geoffrey had already decided that this is where he wanted the hotel to be, and he was just play acting. But here's this lovely cartoon by Sumangala showing Geoffrey playing with his toy bricks and dreaming of this hotel. And it was on a very remote site. You could hardly get to it at the time. There's a ridge that came down. Here's this ridge that comes down to the edge of the tank. And Geoffrey wanted the hotel to be on this side of the ridge against a cave. And this was the site visit where Geoffrey had to be taken in a palanquin to see the site. And this is an early drawing and a model, very rare for Bawa to use a model. But he wanted the hotel to be close to the cliff face of the ridge, and for you to arrive here from this side, totally unaware of the tank or of the hotel, and you would go through a cave, through the rock, and suddenly discover this incredible view toward Sigiriya. And these are these lovely drawings that were done after the event. But you can see on here how the rooms hug the cliff and look out through jungle toward the... And there was a lot of opposition. People said, oh, it's going to ruin this beautiful view of this hill, this mountain. But actually, the way it's been designed, it's almost disappeared completely from view. You can hardly see it at all. And here it is, completely covered in vegetation. Very simple building, Miesian almost. You enter it at the top level, just the way the topography, and there are 5 floors below. And it is like a belvedere. It's for looking out of. And it's almost like a huge Noah's Ark which has run aground. And you're stranded, and you look out across this jungle. And there's the cave that you enter through. And then when you get to the other side, you get this fantastic view across the lake towards Sigiriya. And that's the corridors that run along the cliff face. And it's very Spartan, very, very rough materials, stone lintels, wooden doors, very simple furniture. It's all about the view. The architecture doesn't compete with the view. And the rooms are open toward the view. So the bathroom, you can sit on the toilet, you can go in the bath, you can have a shower, but all the time you're looking out towards the view. And at night, the rock crashes into the rooms. It's a night view and a day view. And there again, the rock crashing in. And here the main restaurant with the cliff and the jungle behind it. And the facades have got this grill system so that the greenery grows up, and then you get monkeys clambering all over the building. And that's this one of the 2 swimming pools, but you can swim in the pool and look out towards the Sigiriya rock on the tank. And then this is the next project from that period, a house for a man called Jayakodi, very difficult shaped site in the centre of Colombo. It looks like nothing at all from the outside, but it's actually this 4-storey mixture of a tower and courtyard house. You can see here the entrance, one courtyard, another courtyard. And here, the dining room and this blue-coloured light well, which I'll show you. So that when you're at the ground floor, it's like being at the bottom of a treacle well. And you are so cut off from the heat of the sun, and it's reflected down and is cool and green. And then, yes, these are just views of the ground floor. And then here is this dining room, and this tower which brings this cool light down, but also serves as a chimney. So all the warm air rises up this tower. And then halfway up, this loggia, and then on the very top, as a great surprise, a swimming pool. Then another hotel, the Lighthouse Hotel, on the southern tip of Sri Lanka. Very simple, the main entrance with this staircased run, and then the room is set back, so you have one space which is an internal courtyard, and another space which is where the pool is, which opens up to the ocean. These are just views of it. It's very much on the edge of this very rough sea, where the monsoon comes rolling in. And that's the entrance, and this staircase with these figures of Dutch and Sinhalese warriors fighting. And then you're the feeling of being almost on board a ship, going on your way, P&O lines to Australia. And the courtyard, and then upstairs an upper courtyard, and the dining room and a bar. Have this feeling of being on a 19th century ship somehow. And the swimming pool. Sorry, that slipped. And the room, looking out to sea. And if we could have Thank you. One last hotel, the Blue Water, which is close to Colombo, and a really lousy site between a railway line and the sea in a coconut grove. But Geoffrey turned it into an incredible Palladian palace. You enter at this point at Port Cocher, and you have this long axis out to the sea, and at this point an axis this way. This shows him in 1997, just before his stroke, still working in a wheelchair on site. And this is Sumangala, the man who did these cartoons. And here we see the entrance, the Port Cocher, and this, as soon as the door opens, this faraway, distant view of the sea. And then this is the axis when the door opens, and the sea in the distance. And that's the return axis looking back towards the entrance. And this is the cross axis, which is from this point here. So it's a very classical, very, very stripped sort of architecture. You could call it minimalist. And these are just views of this hotel. Quickly. So this is the work of a man at this time, 78 years old. And these lovely screen effects, which are to keep out the rain and to break up the sun. And a room and a pausing space. This furniture is furniture designed by Geoffrey with a friend called Rico Talawala. And then the very last project of all, which was done, it was completed in December of 97. And this is a house for a young man called Pradeep Jayawardena, who was the grandson of the former president of Sri Lanka. This is the client, here's Geoffrey, and this is Channa Daswata, his partner, and this shows Geoffrey on the site, still at that stage in charge of everything, and making sure that everything was perfect. And this is the house, a very simple pavilion on the top of a cliff, and you see it, you can see it there. If I go back, that the pavilion is almost lost. The verticals correspond to the palm trees, and there you see it. Very simple, just a roof, and it's completely open, and then the bedrooms are half sunk under the ground below a raised dining platform. So it's as if, you could say, this is a process that has gone on 40 years. 40 years separate this house from the very first house I showed you. And you could think that this is somehow very different, but it's actually part of the same process. And it's a process really of stripping away. These are just views of the main sitting area, and that's the lower courtyard where the bedrooms are. And we've gone wrong here. Well, I'm going to very quickly end. That was Geoffrey Bawa's last project that was built. And as I say, very soon after that, he had this terrible stroke, which happened 4 years ago, and he's still in the same condition today. I was with him last week, 2 weeks ago, in Colombo. Very briefly, the other two things which are worth looking at briefly. First of all, Bawa's own house, which in Colombo actually was originally a row of 4 bungalows, little old bungalows, which he bought one after the other until he had all 4 of them. And there was a lane that ran along here and a garage at this end. And he knocked all of this away and created this corridor with courtyards and a labyrinth, which is an incredible mixture of covered and uncovered spaces. And then he knocked the first house down and built a tower, almost like Corb's Maison Citron. This is the little lane that it's in. There's the garage entrance. We go through that door, and here's the Rolls-Royce that Geoffrey actually bought when he was at the AA. So this Rolls-Royce used to turn up in front of Bedford Square, and Geoffrey would get out and probably park it wherever he fancied. And this sits now it's a decorative piece. It never runs. It's up on chocks, but it's in perfect working order. And you go past this car, down this white corridor towards this horse's head, and then turn at this little courtyard, and you find yourself in the main sitting area, and there's a small fountain gurgling away. But from 1948 onwards, Bawa's main concern was the garden at Lunuganga. And the inspiration for this really came from his love affair with Italy. And his friend at Cambridge was this man, Guy Strutt, whose aunt had married an Italian count. She was called the Duchessa di Lazio. And she owned this house which overlooked Lake Garda. And Geoffrey said, that's what I want. I want to live in Italy, and I want a house like this and a garden like that. But in the end he realized that wasn't possible, and decided instead to create this garden in Sri Lanka. And I suppose the things that inspired him were his memories of English landscape. This is Stourhead, and one of his favorite places, the Alhambra in Granada. And this shows the coast. Here's Toto, where the hotel was, and inland from here a lake with a promontory, and this is where Lunuganga is situated, and that's just a drawing which shows the same thing. And this is the frontispiece of a book on Lunuganga. It is truly one of the most beautiful gardens, 20th century gardens, that exists. And Geoffrey worked on it for the whole 50 years, from 1948 until 1998. And in fact, he still goes there, and even though he's paralysed, he does take some part in directing the gardeners with the cutting and so on. This is the first view of it on your way there. It's in the trees, and then you go on a wild goose chase and come around the other side, and you arrive at this gateway, and then at the entrance court, and these wonderful staircases, which lead you up to a terrace, and you get this fantastic view across. This is a view which Geoffrey created. He removed all the trees. He cut the hill down by about 6 feet, so you would see the lagoon beyond. And it's not a very good photograph. There's a white temple, a Dagobah, on the top of that hill. So you arrive here, Geoffrey might be there to greet you, and this is Channa. And then you look and you get this wonderful view, which completely artificial creation. And there's a nice story. I mean, I could go on all night telling you stories, but the priest from this temple heard that Geoffrey had created this view. And so he came one day and said, "Mr. Bawa, I hear that you sit and look at my temple." And Geoffrey said, "Yes, it's very beautiful." And he said, "Well, the temple needs painting. And seeing that you look at my temple every day, you should perhaps pay for the painting of the Dagobah." So Geoffrey said, "Well, yes, I can see your point, but actually I can only see half of the Dagobah. So I'll pay to have half of it painted, and I'm not bothered about the other half." And so that was what was agreed. And of course the priest had to pay for the other half to be painted. And this is the house which had existed from the end of the 19th century, which Geoffrey added and added to create courtyards. And this is his bedroom and the little courtyard beyond, which is a sort of bathroom courtyard. And here's another little courtyard with a veranda beyond. And then the house surrounded by these trained aralia trees and views down into the valley. This is the work pavilion, the studio which he built. A lovely room. And this is the art gallery, and these are the steps down from the hill to the broad walk, which is over here, and the water gardens, the rice fields. And this is a view back towards the main house and that figure. And you can see that whilst it all looks very natural, it's a work of art. Even the rice is planted in these patterns that all add to this view. And this is one last building, a bungalow on the edge of the garden, which we call the Cinnamon Hill House, which was for guests. You enter, you get this view. And this, strangely enough, if you cast your mind back to the beginning of the talk, is almost like a sort of reflection on Bawa's work. And there's almost a hint of the Bandra chapel with the crucifixes and the glass wall that you looked out to paradise. No glass now, but just a view of paradise. And then this table, which is almost like an altar table. So this sitting room has the quality of a chapel. And this is the visitors' book, which people who came would be asked to do a drawing or add a photograph. And this rather nice drawing from 1973 by the Australian artist Donald Friend, for whom Geoffrey was designing a museum in Barley, and he did the sketch with the drawing that Geoffrey had done of the Musée de Batajimba. So that's really the end. It's very sad. I mean, this garden has been a very important part of Geoffrey's life. It was the inspiration for him to become an architect. It was the garden that sent him to the AA to study architecture, and it's been the centre of his life. But he is still alive, but really very ill, but still aware of things. And I was very pleased last week to be able to show him the book finally. I happen to believe that he is one of the most important Asian architects of the 20th century. He has had an enormous influence, not just in Sri Lanka, but in India, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia. And I think he's been a very important figure in demonstrating that it is possible to find a resolution of the conflict between the notion of globalization and the idea of a regional architecture, a local architecture. I think he created a new architectural language, a new sort of consciousness for modern post-colonial, post-independent Sri Lanka. And he has had an enormous influence. If you go to Sri Lanka today, you'll see that almost every building is actually in some way influenced by Bawa, although very few people would ever admit to that or agree that that is the case. So there we are. I'm sorry that there are only 5 of you, but anyway, I still thought I'd do it. And I don't know if you have any questions or.
A really quick one. Why did he keep practice for so long under another name? Why did it take him sort of relatively recently to sort of leave Edward's
I think initially there was this incredible snobism in Sri Lanka. There was an idea that the sorts of clients that they were interested in at the beginning would want, prefer an architect that had a European connection. And it's one of the interesting things about Bawa, that he always played on this ambivalence. He was half European and half Sri Lankan. He always had one foot in Asia and one foot in Europe. He was educated in Europe, but somehow deep down, I didn't say enough about this, but that dilemma of identity when he didn't buy a house in Italy and came back to Sri Lanka was an acceptance of the fact that he was probably more Asian than European. But even so, in the post-colonial Colombo of the 1950s, if your practice was called Edwards Reed and Begg, that seemed to be more, you were going to be more successful. I think there are many examples of this. But also, I think Geoffrey had this sort of lawyer's mind, and he remained always a lawyer. And I think he had this fear always that one might, if a building went wrong, one might get sued. And somehow he felt safer practicing under the name of these 3 dead men rather than under his own name. Yeah, well.
It wasn't until today that I realised that a lot of those drawings aren't actually done by him.
No, there's no. That's in a way the whole point of the exhibition, because the exhibition says it's Geoffrey Bawa drawings, and he signed them. But if you look at the exhibition, we don't pretend that the drawings are by him. If you look at the captions, you discover what is the actual situation. And I'm really trying to draw attention to something which is actually totally standard in architects' offices. If you look at a scheme by Norman Foster, or for instance, Richard Rogers was talking here yesterday. Very few of the drawings that are done in those practices are done by those people. So that there's a slight irony in this, that Bawa, he drew all the time, but he only drew sketches, and there are a couple of his sketches upstairs. But he caused these drawings, there was a very definite way of drawing, which was a Geoffrey Bawa way of drawing, which he didn't actually do the drawings, but the people who he employed developed with him a way of drawing, which became very famous through the White Book. And I thought it was very interesting, and one of the things I've tried to bring out in the book is I'm interested in the idea that Geoffrey Bawa exists as an individual person called Geoffrey Bawa, but there's also a concept which is like a team, a group of people who they played like in a football team with a particular shirt, but the players changed every 2 or 3 years. But all the time there was this team like Manchester United, which was the Geoffrey Bawa team, and they were working together, and they created this continuity of drawing, style, and architecture. And I think that's how it is. But I don't think I think a lot of people who write about architecture don't take that into account. We're continually being kidded that, all of these drawings were done by Norman Foster. And it ain't the case. But that doesn't mean that Bawa was not absolutely 100% involved in all of the designs. I mean, he was very much a part of it. But he also knew how to delegate, and he had brilliant people working for him, and he knew how to get the best out of them. And the drawings upstairs, some of them, I think, I hope you agree, are absolutely beautiful. But they're certainly not by him necessarily.
Well, continuing on what Father said, I met a few people who work. I actually, I went back in the past 2 years, and I've been beating Lunuganga, what the pictures have shown. The thing is, one of them said that Bawa almost seemed, he wished he could draw as well as the people on. And I was just wondering whether he whether he felt that from.
I don't think that's, in my experience, I wouldn't say that that was true. Part of it was that Geoffrey was, in a way, quite patrician in his bearing. And as far as he was concerned, in the hierarchy of the office, the notion of actually drafting, was something that it wasn't for him to do. He was a conductor. It was almost, in a sense, beneath him, the notion of actually doing drawings. That may have been partly to cover up the fact that he wasn't very good at drawing. But if you look at his sketches, they have Anura Ratnavibhashana, who did several of the drawings upstairs and who worked very closely with Geoffrey, says that his thumbnail sketches, when they were developing a scheme, were fantastic, that he could draw almost perfectly to scale by sketching, and he did sections and so on. But he never did final drawings. However, just on the other side of the argument, to support what you're saying, we only have 2 audio recordings of Geoffrey Bawa's voice, which is very sad, but there's only 2 audio recordings. And one of them is a lecture that he gave in 1982 in India. And he is asked at that, did you do those drawings? And he says, alas, no, I cannot draw. So perhaps he did feel that, he regretted that he couldn't draw. But in a way, he didn't need to be able to draw. He had this incredible ability to envisage 3-dimensional space in his head, and he could communicate it to the people who worked with him. So I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that you have to be a great draftsman to be a great architect.
Is that why you think that he didn't make so many models? Because he could sort of, a lot of his architecture is dependent on the site. And I would have thought that, if it's about that kind of shaping to a rock, you'd actually sort of experiment with sort of, in 3 dimensions.
But he experimented on the site, you see. He actually spent his time on the site. And if necessary, if things weren't quite right, he would have something pulled down and moved. Because he was his way of designing was very much like stage set. It was scenography. His buildings are designed so you move through them, and it's what you see and when you see it. And I think he found models were a distraction, because for him even the model doesn't really represent the site, and he preferred to go to the site and talk to his colleagues and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, then go back to the office, draw it, then go back to the site. And the only schemes that he really did with models were Ruhunu, which is this very complicated university campus on a hillside, and there was a model for Kandalama. But I don't recall ever seeing other models. There were perhaps little sketch models in the office, but it wasn't a major, for him, it wasn't a necessary part of a process. I think he found them too fiddly. Anyway, you see, you can't get inside models. And you know, for him it was about spatial sequences. So... Well, thank you for